The evening air in the city was heavy with the scent of rain-soaked streets and expensive perfume. Inside Le Marquis, one of the most exclusive restaurants downtown, the quiet hum of polite conversation mingled with the delicate notes of a live piano. Every detail in the place was curated. Crystal glasses catching the candlelight, waiters gliding in perfect synchronicity, and muted tones of wealth whispering through the atmosphere. At a secluded corner table sat Richard Armand, a man who didn't need to announce his status. His presence did it for him. Known in the business world as a deal maker with an uncanny instinct for profit, Richard was the kind of man who commanded attention without ever raising his voice. His suit was tailored to perfection, his watch a discreet but unmistakable symbol of his success, and his posture that of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. The dinner had been a formal affair, a contract negotiation that had gone in his favor. The plates before him bore evidence of a gourmet meal: thinly sliced truffle steak, garlic roasted vegetables, and a delicate soufflé for dessert. Now, as the last of the champagne fizzed in his glass, Richard leaned back, loosening his tie ever so slightly, his mind already drifting to the next day's schedule. That's when he heard it. A voice, soft, trembling, and almost uncertain, came from just behind his shoulder. "May I have your leftovers, sir?" Richard turned, his brows knitting together. People didn't approach him this way. Not here. Not in this world of polished surfaces and unspoken rules. At first, he expected to see a panhandler putting on a practiced expression, someone working a routine for sympathy, but what he saw stopped him mid-thought. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, her face framed by wisps of hair that had escaped from a messy bun. Her coat was threadbare with mismatched buttons, the kind of garment that had survived too many winters. The edges of her sleeves were frayed, and her shoes, though clean, had clearly seen better day. She stood with her shoulders slightly hunched, as though ready to retreat at the first sign of rejection. But it wasn't her clothing or her posture that struck Richard. It was her eyes. They were a deep, stormy shade, holding a quiet desperation, but also a strange strength. It was the kind of look that spoke of battles fought alone, nights endured without comfort, and dreams buried but not entirely forgotten. For a moment Richard didn't answer. He was a man used to calculated decisions, but this request caught him off guard. He found himself studying her expression, wondering why it felt so oddly familiar. The woman shifted her weight from one foot to the other, fingers fidgeting with the strap of an old canvas bag slung over her shoulder. She seemed almost embarrassed to have spoken, as though asking for scraps from his table was somehow worse than hunger itself. Richard's instinct was to brush her off politely. People asked for favors all the time, though rarely this directly. Yet something in her eyes rooted him to the moment, kept him from dismissing her as just another fleeting encounter. With a small nod, he signaled to the waiter. "Pack up what's left," he said, his voice eager. The waiter hesitated for a fraction of a second. This wasn't a common request from patrons like Richard, but quickly complied, locking the untouched portions with careful hands. When the waiter handed her the bag, the woman's lips curved into a faint, almost reluctant smile. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carrying both relief and something else, something harder to name. Richard didn't respond, only inclined his head slightly. But as she turned and walked toward the door, disappearing into the cool night, he felt a pull deep in his chest. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, and yet he couldn't shake the sense that their paths had crossed for a reason. That night Richard sat in the back of his black sedan, the city lights flickering past like memories he couldn't quite catch. Normally, after a successful business meeting, he would call a colleague, check in on the markets, or think ahead to his next big project. But this time his thoughts were fixed on the young woman from the restaurant. It was unusual for him. Richard prided himself on being emotionally disciplined. In his world, sentiment was a liability, yet her eyes, those stormy eyes, kept surfacing in his mind like an unfinished sentence. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just curiosity, nothing more. The next day, Richard went about his usual routine: morning gym session, back-to-back meetings, and a lunch with an investment partner. But as he sat in his office that afternoon, reviewing a property deal, he caught himself wondering if she had eaten the food right away or saved it for later. He pictured her sitting somewhere cold, rationing each bite, perhaps sharing it with someone else. By evening, his curiosity had grown into a quiet restlessness. On impulse, he decided to take a walk, something he rarely did without a purpose. The air was crisp, and the streets were alive with the hum of traffic and the occasional sound of street performers. His feet carried him toward the same area as the restaurant, almost without conscious thought, and then he saw her. She was sitting on the low stone steps of a bookstore that had long since closed for the night. The same coat, the same shoes, the same way she held herself, as if she were trying to occupy as little space as possible. Beside her was the canvas bag from before, folded neatly on her lap. She wasn't eating, she was sketching. Richard slowed his pace, watching her from a distance. Her hands moved with quick, deliberate strokes over a small, worn sketch pad. Even from where he stood, he could see the precision in her lines, the quiet concentration on her face. Whatever she was drawing, it was absorbing her completely. Finally, he stepped closer. "You again," he said, his tone halfway between curiosity and surprise. She looked up, startled. Her eyes flicked over him, recognition dawning slowly. "I didn't think I'd see you again," she said softly. "I could say the same," Richard replied. He nodded toward the sketch pad. "You draw." A faint blush colored her cheeks. She hesitated, as if deciding whether to answer. "Sometimes," she said at last, closing the pad slightly, as though to shield her work. Richard considered her for a moment. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the sketch pad. She paused, then reluctantly handed it over. The page was filled with a beautifully detailed drawing of the restaurant they had met in. Its arched windows, soft lighting, and even the way the candlelight reflected off the glasses. It wasn't just accurate, it was alive. "This is impressive," he said, his voice genuine. She shrugged, glancing away. "It's nothing, just something to pass the time." Richard handed it back, but the image stayed with him. This wasn't the work of someone idly doodling. It was the work of someone with real talent, and perhaps no outlet for it. "What's your name?" he asked. There was a hesitation, as though the answer was a secret she wasn't sure she should share. "Lena," she finally said. "Lena," he repeated, letting the name settle in his mind. "Do you always ask strangers for leftovers?" Her lips curved in the smallest of smiles, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Only when I'm hungry." He wanted to ask more about where she lived, why she was here, what had brought her to this point, but something told him pushing too hard might make her retreat. So instead he said, "Come on, let's get you a proper meal." She hesitated again, eyes narrowing slightly. "Why?" Richard found he didn't have a simple answer. "Let's just say, I'm curious." Lena studied him for a long moment before slowly standing, her bag slung over her shoulder. The city lights cast a halo around her messy hair as she fell into step beside him, the night ahead holding questions neither of them yet knew how to ask. The warm glow of the cafe's interior was a sharp contrast to the chill of the night outside. Richard pushed open the door and held it for Lena, who stepped in cautiously, her eyes scanning the place as though she didn't belong. The smell of freshly baked bread and rich coffee hung in the air, wrapping the room in a kind of comfort money couldn't buy. Richard chose a quiet corner booth. He noticed that Lena hesitated before sitting, as though she was ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. Her bag stayed on her lap, clutched protectively. A waitress arrived with menus, but Lena didn't touch hers. She glanced at the prices and closed it quickly. Richard pretended not to notice. "Order whatever you like," he said, his tone casual but firm. She hesitated. "The soup is fine." Richard frowned. "You'll have more than soup. You need a real meal." A flicker of something pride crossed her face. "Soup is enough," she repeated. He decided not to press further, and placed an order for her anyway. A steaming bowl of minestrone, fresh bread and a plate of pasta. For himself, he ordered coffee. As they waited, the silence between them wasn't exactly uncomfortable, but it wasn't easy either. Richard leaned forward. "You're an artist," he said, referring to the sketch he'd seen earlier. Her eyes darted up to his, then back down to her hands. "Not really. I used to, but that was a long time ago." "Used to?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she traced an invisible pattern on the table with her fingertip. Finally, she said, "Life got in the way." Richard didn't push. He was used to people opening up under the right conditions, and something told him Lena's trust had to be earned in layers, not demanded all at once. When the food arrived, Lena's eyes widened despite herself. She picked up her spoon, but before eating, she closed her eyes for the briefest moment, as though silently thanking someone. Richard noticed, but kept it to himself. As she ate, her pace was slow, deliberate, almost as if she was savoring every bite. At one point, she paused and looked out the window, her gaze far away. "I used to come to places like this," she murmured. "Used to?" He asked. "Again. My parents, they'd take me out after my music recitals. We didn't have much money, but they always made those nights special. Then, she stopped abruptly, swallowing hard. Then everything changed. Richard could see the wall going back up, so he shifted the subject. Music recitals. You played. She nodded faintly. Violin. I was good too, or at least I thought I was. I'm sure you were, he said softly. For a moment the air between them warmed. She gave the smallest of smiles before returning to her meal. After they finished, Richard settled the bill. Lena tried to protest, but he waved it off. As they stepped outside, the night air felt sharper, the hum of the city quieter somehow. Richard glanced at her. Do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight? Her shoulders stiffened. I'm fine. That's not an answer, he said. She looked away. Safe is a matter of perspective. Richard studied her for a moment. He'd dealt with stubborn negotiators, ruthless competitors, and high-stakes deals. But Lena was a puzzle unlike any he'd encountered. Every answer seemed designed to reveal just enough to keep him intrigued, but not enough to truly know her. They walked together in silence, until they reached an intersection. Lena stopped. Thank you for the meal, she said, her voice barely above the hum of passing cars. You don't have to thank me, Richard replied, but if you ever need help, real help, fine. He pulled a business card from his coat and held it out. She took it hesitantly, slipping it into her bag without looking at it. Then, without another word, she turned and melted into the crowd, leaving Richard standing alone, under the streetlight, watching her disappear. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know yet, was that this was only the beginning, and that the truth behind her guarded eyes would change both their lives in ways neither could predict. 3 days had passed since Richard last saw Lena. Her sudden disappearance that night had left him uneasy. He found himself scanning the streets, hoping she would reappear, but she did. It was on the 4th evening, just as the winter sun dipped behind the skyline, that Richard spotted her again. This time not outside the cafe, but sitting on the cold pavement, near a bus terminal, her knees tucked to her chest. A small cardboard sign in front of her that simply read, "Hung." The sight sent a sharp pang through him. He crossed the street without thinking. Lena, he called gently. She looked up, startled, and for a moment her eyes softened in recognition. But then, as if embarrassed, she looked away. Richard, I told you, I'm fine. You're not, he said firmly, and you don't have to be. He crouched down in front of her. Come with me, just for tonight. You can rest, eat, and if you want to leave tomorrow, I won't stop you. She hesitated, then finally nodded. Back at Richard's penthouse, Lena seemed almost afraid to step inside. The polished marble floors, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, the warmth. It was all a world away from where she'd been living. I don't belong here, she whispered. That's nonsense, Richard replied, taking her coat. Sit, I'll make tea. When he returned, he found her standing in front of a grand violin case in the corner of his living room. You play? She asked quietly. Not like I used to, he admitted. Business took over my life, but I keep it as a reminder that music was my first love. Her fingers hovered over the case, almost reverent. May I? Richard nodded. She opened it slowly, as if afraid the instrument might vanish if she moved too quickly. Then she lifted the violin, held it under her chin, and without hesitation, began to play. The first note was pure and haunting, cutting through the silence like sunlight through fog. Richard froze. He had heard the world's most celebrated musicians, but this was different. Every note was filled with both precision and pain, mastery and memory. When she finished, the room was heavy with silence. Richard spoke first. Lena, that was extraordinary. Why are you on the streets? Her eyes glistened. Because life doesn't care how talented you are. My parents died when I was 16. I had no family, no money. I tried to keep studying music, but without connections or support, it became impossible. I worked odd jobs, played in subways, but the world moves fast, and if you stumble, she looked away, you get left behind. Richard felt something stir deep within him. Anger at her situation, admiration for her resilience, and a sudden, undeniable resolve. What if I told you I could change that? That I could make sure you never have to beg again? She shook her head. I'm not a charity case. This isn't charity, he said firmly. This is talent that deserves to be heard, and I happen to have the resources to make that happen. Lena stared at him, searching his face for any sign of pity. There was none, only conviction. 3 months later, the concert hall was packed. Critics, patrons, and music lovers had gathered, buzzing with anticipation over the mysterious new violinist, who had seemingly come from nowhere. Backstage, Lena adjusted her dress, her hands trembling.
Not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. Richard stood beside her, offering a steady nod. "Show them who you are." When she stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. Then, with the same violin she had played in Richard's living room, she began. The music soared, weaving through the air like a living thing. It was raw, it was beautiful, and it was unmistakably hers. By the final note, the entire hall was on its feet, the applause thundering like a storm. Later, as she stepped out to meet the crowd, Lena saw something that made her breath catch. A group of young music students holding signs that read, "You inspire us." She turned to Richard, tears in her eyes. "I thought my life was over." Sometimes all it takes is one person to remind you it's just beginning. And in that moment, Lena knew the miracle wasn't just being rescued from the streets. The real miracle was finding someone who believed in her enough to put her back on the stage where she belonged.